Gold melted under the Syrian sun. Dust choked the lungs. Roman legions were on their knees, not before gods, but before a torrential rain of arrows. One has to wonder, how did the greatest military machine of antiquity become a laughingstock for nomads? Why did the empire that swallowed half the world tremble for 5 centuries at a single word? The East. This is paradox number 1. And here is mystery number 2. How did the trauma of one long-forgotten battle force generations of brilliant emperors to sacrifice millions of lives just for a dignified obituary? The answer is buried in the scorching sands of Carrhae. The deep roots of a great imperial fear rot there still. 53 BC, Marcus Licinius Crassus hungered for the glory of Alexander the Great. He financed a massive army and marched it into a blistering desert. It was a fatal mistake. Parthian horsemen didn't form up in traditional phalanxes. They circled the Roman lines, firing continuously and mocking them openly. Rome's heavy infantry was transformed into a giant, lumbering target. Imagine yourself in a centurion's boots in that meat grinder. Your wooden shield groans and cracks under the weight of heavy hits. Your hands shake uncontrollably from sheer exhaustion. The persistent taste of sand and someone else's blood fills your parched throat. You cannot see your enemy. You only hear the endless, maddening whistle of arrows. Death arrives from the sweltering void, dressed in expensive silk and shooting straight from a full gallop. 7 legions ceased to exist in a single bloody day. The golden eagles of proud Rome passed to a gloating enemy. Crassus's severed head became a cheap theatrical prop. Imperial vanity turned into absolute, bone-chilling humiliation. The words of a general from those years echoed the sentiment. The Parthians mocked us, shouting that our weapons were made of rot, not iron. A strike. A short pause. Another dull strike. This monstrous slaughter left Rome with a deep, festering wound. A psychological trauma the size of a continent. The surviving legionnaires no longer feared the wild barbarians of the north. They were scared to death of the elusive shadows of the east. Centuries slowly passed. Ambitious emperors succeeded one another. Great Rome degraded, divided, and cracked at the seams. But that clammy fear lived on. It seeped, unnoticed, into the marble offices of the Senate. It ruthlessly poisoned every diplomatic move. The fragile peace with the Persians always reeked of the cadaverous rot of Carrhae. The eastern frontier became a cursed, God-forsaken place. Being stationed there was considered a guaranteed one-way ticket. What would you feel, standing on that blood-soaked earth? Could you keep your sanity in that endless meat grinder? Rome methodically paid in heavy gold. Rome humiliatingly bought temporary silence. But that silence was nothing but a cruel illusion. This wasn't the elegant diplomacy of wise men. This was a paralyzing, primal terror of the East. A terror awkwardly dressed in the toga of state pragmatism. Every new embassy to the Persian court hid the treacherous trembling in the envoy's knees. Crassus's dead legionnaires stubbornly dictated foreign policy to living Caesars. The mistakes of proud men from the past became a solid prison for the people of the present. Seasoned generals were terrified of taking risks. Scheming politicians preferred to simply pay tribute. The empire's bureaucratic machine worked flawlessly. Scribes dryly recorded the population loss, and quartermasters cold-bloodedly wrote off lost weapons. No one counted the broken lives. A legionnaire's life turned into dry statistics on parchment. War had finally ceased to be a noble matter of honor. It had turned into a cold-blooded business, a cynical deal with a hungry death. And the bloody price of that deal rose rapidly with every passing decade. Bruised Roman pride desperately demanded a quick rematch. But Roman fear categorically demanded a safe compromise. This irreconcilable internal conflict ruthlessly tore the ancient empire into bleeding pieces. The vanity of the capital's elite was easily converted into new mountains of common soldiers' corpses. Tens of thousands of lives were mindlessly tossed into the insatiable sandy maw of the mysterious East. Emperors did this simply to prove their own fictional significance to themselves. They sent legions to certain slaughter, wanting, if only for a moment, to drown out the contemptuous laughter of the ghosts of Parthian archers in their ears. As a contemporary of those long and senseless events wrote, "We were no longer fighting living men of flesh. We were fiercely hacking at our own reflection." Some rulers built high stone walls, hoping to hold back the encroaching death. Others feverishly forged sharp swords, desiring to bring that death to the enemy. But all their efforts proved absolutely powerless against blind chance. Toxic historical memory was passed down like a prized family heirloom, acting as a slow, inevitable poison. This poison steadily killed the massive state organism from within. The East became a ruthless mirror of Rome's own weaknesses, and that distorted mirror was physically painful to look at. Every new local clash on the sweltering border was a pathetic attempt to smash that cursed glass. But it only became covered in fine cracks, endlessly multiplying the distorted faces of doomed men. By the end of the 5th century, when the scorching sun had finally burned out the old ideals, the collective Roman psyche was eaten away to its very foundation. The crippled state prepared for yet another inevitable war, a war it was terrified to win. Because true victory required stepping forever out of the cozy shadow of old familiar defeats, and staying in that dark shadow felt much safer and more familiar. While the heavy dust of old imperial complexes settled on one stony bank of the border river, an entirely new storm was rapidly brewing on the other. The storm had a formidable name: the Sassanids. The Parthian archers who had laughed at the Roman legions had long since rotted in the harsh sands. The 3rd century gave the ancient East new, far more ruthless masters. This wasn't just a trivial change of a ruling dynasty. This was a total reboot of the imperial cultural code. The new lords were not at all satisfied with the free life of nomads. They were maniacally obsessed with restoration. The majestic ghosts of the ancient Achaemenids lived in their inflamed minds. They sincerely believed that the entire world, from the Nile to the Bosphorus, rightfully belonged to their golden throne. Religion and limitless power merged into a single monolithic steel fist. Dissenters were methodically ground into bloody dust. Any diplomatic compromise was considered unacceptable weakness. There was absolutely nowhere to retreat. Behind them stood a blinding pride, heavy as granite. The pride of this aggressive new empire was its reborn army, or rather, its elite, untouchable core, the Savaron. This was a glittering, heavy cavalry that had no equal in the world under the moon. Forget about nimble, half-naked riders with light bows. Now, a slow, inevitable armored steamroller rolled onto the bloody arena. Men and massive horses were completely encased in thick iron scales, resembling soulless, living metal statues. The mere sight of this advancing, glittering sea drove the enemy infantry into a primal, paralyzing horror. As a shocked contemporary wrote, "Their armor fits their bodies so tightly that it seems they are not living men, but monolithic pieces of iron forged in the very center of hell." A strike. A perfect, foolproof machine for breaking defenses. But in every perfect state mechanism, there is a hidden, fatal flaw. That flaw was the exorbitant price the Persian elite paid for their exceptional status. Imagine yourself in the place of a noble rider on the day of an exhausting march. You are wearing 40 kilograms of metal, heated by the ruthless sun. You are slowly suffocating in this elite, expensive oven. Your vision is severely restricted by the narrow slits of a heavy helmet. You physically cannot turn your head. You are absolutely unable to look back. You look only in a narrow line straight ahead. You are no longer a clever, flexible tactician. You are simply a blind projectile of massive, destructive power. The armor designed to reliably protect a fragile life had quietly turned into a suffocating, cramped personal prison. A step to the left or a step to the right became physically and morally impossible. Assassinate attack could only be a straightforward frontal assault, and it had to be crushing. But crushing physical power was completely neutralized by a monstrous bureaucracy of death. The Sassanid war machine was a precise reflection of the rigid, paranoid Persian court. Every unit knew its strict, historically unchanging place. Maintaining hierarchy was 1,000 times more important than common sense on the battlefield. Commanders were terrified, their knees shaking, of showing the slightest initiative. Making an unexpected flanking maneuver meant willfully breaking the formation. Breaking the perfect formation meant publicly losing face before the King of Kings. And for a noble Persian aristocrat, losing face was hundreds of times worse than the most sophisticated execution. The fear of making an irreparable mistake shackled the minds of generals far more tightly than steel breastplates. Any order from the distant capital was an unquestionable sacred law. If the King of Kings ordered an attack strictly through the center, the army would doomedly strike the center, even if a sheer cliff had suddenly grown there, or a bottomless abyss had opened up. Common sense silently and cowardly gave way to fanatical loyalty and the fear of punishment. Scribes in the supply trains calculated future state profits in advance with startling cynicism, dryly dividing foreign lands that were yet to be conquered. War for the Persian elite had turned into a pompous, well-oiled administrative process, the routine filling out of ledger sheets for other people's stolen lives. It was a cold, mathematical calculation multiplied by absolute, blinding megalomania. Megalomania and rigid court rules had forever burned out the Persians' capacity for tactical improvisation. Their generals had long been fighting not on real terrain, but on an imaginary, ideal chessboard, where every richly decorated piece moves only according to an algorithm refined over centuries. They sincerely believed that their high status and the dazzling gleam of their equipment guaranteed the automatic, unconditional surrender of any enemy they met. No one wanted to get their well-groomed hands dirty in the soil. War had turned into an arrogant, deadly ritual, a lavish, theatrical parade with a predetermined, victorious finale. But one day, this flawless parade suffered a critical failure. After several long decades of sluggish, exhausting border conflicts, the Persian court made one fatal, uncompromising decision. They wanted to put a final, thick, bloody period on their relationship with the West. They gathered a steel fist of unprecedented power and, without hesitation, threw it forward. The movement of this mass seemed truly unstoppable. Tens of thousands of men encased in solid steel marched toward the Byzantine borders in a measured rhythm, like a single organism. The parched earth groaned deeply under the hooves of elite war horses. The empire carried the arrogance of an entire era on the tips of its spears. They brought heavy chains of pure silver for future high-ranking captives. They had prepared haughty speeches for the defeated Roman cities in advance. The tragedy of any great power is that, intoxicated by itself, it completely stops looking at its feet. The dazzling Persian steamroller rolled slowly but inevitably toward a man who preferred to dream in silence. Far from the clatter of Persian hooves, in the cool silence of Constantinople's palaces, reality was hopelessly losing its sharp edges. Emperor Justinian suffered from a dangerous, incurable form of political blindness. He daydreamed desperately, maniacally obsessed with the return of a lost golden age. He looked at dusty old maps and stubbornly saw a great, indivisible empire. He flatly refused to notice the rivers of thick human blood required to redraw those ancient borders. In the cool marble halls, war seemed like an elegant, almost aristocratic art. The horrific death of thousands of soldiers was merely a neat column of black figures in the thick ledger of the imperial treasurer. Well-fed armchair strategists thoughtfully moved beautiful carved figures across a smooth table, writing off entire distant provinces as irrevocable losses with frightening ease. They weren't bothered at all by the stench of decomposing bodies in the heat. Justinian desperately needed a loud historical miracle. And to buy that ghostly miracle, he unhesitatingly threw a green kid to be torn apart by the advancing Persian steamroller. 28 years old, an age when high-born capital patricians are only just beginning to grow a soft belly at endless nightly feasts. An age of absolute, screaming inexperience for a commander-in-chief of the entire Eastern Front. The name of this appointed sacrificial lamb was Flavius Belisarius. The capital's military elite grimaced with disdain and arrogance. Old generals, hardened in minor skirmishes, smiled condescendingly into their grey beards. They had already written off the young upstart as a nameless corpse with cold calculation. His hasty dispatch to the border fortress of Dara was considered by them to be a sophisticated, legal political assassination. But Justinian was fatally wrong in one crucial aspect. He didn't send a submissive, doomed victim to the Eastern Front. He sent a ruthless, pedantic anatomist. Belisarius was not at all a cookie-cutter hero from cheap street ballads. He didn't rush into a beautiful, sword-clashing melee. He sincerely despised mindless soldierly bravery. Blind bravery methodically killed people. Only cold, cynical calculation reliably saved state assets. While the capital safely and light-heartedly drank thick, sweet wine to a soon-to-be inevitable victory, the flame of a dim oil lamp flickered nervously in a stifling army tent on the very edge of the Syrian desert. Nearly 6 long centuries after the horrific catastrophe at Carrhae, a man was finally found who firmly decided not to fear the paralyzing past. He cynically decided to dissect it. Belisarius sat motionless for hours over fragile yellow scrolls with dry reports of old bloody defeats. The young general's hands did not grip the heavy hilt of a ceremonial sword. His long fingers nervously and rhythmically spun a thin measuring compass. He was an absolute pedant, a methodical, frighteningly cold mathematician of the coming slaughter. He thoughtfully read the sparse reports of long-dead legions and looked for a strict logic in them. He looked for a critical failure in a complex system, the stupid mistake of the arrogant Crassus, the fatal hot-headedness of the inexperienced Mark Antony, the blind pride of the fanatical Julian the Apostate. Belisarius greedily, like an experienced surgeon, cut open the abscesses of others' grand historical failures. He maniacally searched for an ideal, 100% working algorithm for survival in the upcoming meat grinder. Imagine yourself in the place of his personal night adjutant. You stand submissively at the open entrance of the commander's tent. You clearly feel the bone-chilling night cold of the desert on your own skin. You silently watch the tense, hunched back of the commander. A ringing, ear-pressing, dead silence fills the cramped tent. Only the steady, dry scratch of a sharp quill on rough parchment is heard. No high-flown, fiery speeches about the trampled honor of great Rome. No fervent nightly prayers to indifferent gods for a miraculous salvation. Absolutely nothing extra. Only endless geometric blueprints, complex diagrams of troop maneuvers, and even columns of extremely boring numbers. You suddenly realize one very terrifying fundamental thing. This pale capital youth has no intention of dying heroically here. He intends to kill methodically, on an industrial scale. And right now, he is mathematically calculating the exact ballistic trajectory of every future strike. The coming war in his calculating head is completely devoid of any heroic pathos. It is simply an extremely complex logistical problem with a huge number of unknown variables. The contrast between these two worlds was truly monstrous. In distant Constantinople, lavish church processions tearfully begged the empty heavens for divine protection. But on the dangerous border, a lone pragmatist personally measured the dry, cracked earth with steady strides. With the arrival of a gray dawn, Belisarius resolutely stepped out of the tent into the ruthless, scorching sun. He looked long and carefully at the flat, table-smooth, wide plain before the mud-brick walls of the fortress of Dara. It was a perfect, nature-made parade ground for the deadly acceleration of heavy Persian cavalry. The Sassanid armored steamroller would easily flatten the lumbering Roman infantry here in a few short hours. A direct frontal collision in such ideal conditions for the enemy meant guaranteed 100% annihilation of the entire army. Mathematics was absolutely blind and ruthless toward human lives. 25,000 exhausted Roman soldiers against 40,000 well-fed Persians, fully encased in thick steel. An honest, open fight on this terrain was an act of pure mathematical suicide, and Belisarius understood this perfectly. It was in this long second of dry, extremely cynical analysis that the Roman military system made its first serious, irreversible shift. The young general clearly understood the main, unwritten rule of survival. If the old, noble rules of the game guarantee you a certain, agonizing death, you are simply obligated to break the wooden game board itself. The Persians believed sacredly in the unshakable power of their military traditions. The Persians believed fanatically in the crushing, unstoppable might of their elite mounted armor. They arrogantly expected a classic, dense formation of enemy infantry. They wanted an honest, predictable frontal strike so they could grind it into dust. Belisarius only gave a crooked smirk with his cracked lips. He had no intention of giving them either knightly honor or convenient predictability. He was going to give them impassable mud. A hero to some is always a ruthless butcher to others, but only a cold-blooded, illusion-free accountant is capable of surviving where stupid heroes die en masse. The suffocating silence of mathematical blueprints suddenly ended. The saving algorithm had finally been found. Thin paper gave way forever to harsh, rough reality. The young general disdainfully tossed the broken compass aside. He loudly gave an order that made seasoned, scar-covered old centurions flinch in genuine bewilderment. The Roman border army did not begin to sharpen their dull iron spears as usual. The Roman army did not begin to diligently polish their ceremonial brass armor to a shine. Thousands of calloused hands submissively took up heavy, crude wooden shovels. Belisarius looked at the exhausted, uncomprehending soldiers with the cold, detached indifference of a master architect. He was going to radically reshape the very ideal geometry of this god-cursed plain. The pompous illusions of the capital's imperial dreamers shattered with a crash against the harsh, dirty pragmatism of the trench truth. Tomorrow categorically demanded not a beautiful, even formation with fluttering banners. It sharply demanded a giant, ugly trench dug into the dry earth. Ordinary gray mud, methodically prepared to receive the deadliest geometry of the slaughterhouse into its clutching, sticky embrace. The slaughterhouse began with a simple, dull sound. the dry, rhythmic screech of blunt iron against unyielding Syrian stone. 25,000 men methodically bit into the dry earth. The night mercifully hid their collective shame from prying eyes. Proud sons of great Rome, accustomed to meeting the enemy with an open chest, now hid their eyes from one another. They dug in silence. Belisarius cold-bloodedly ordered them to forget the classic tactics of the legions. Short swords are absolutely useless against an advancing armored steamroller. Only a heavy shovel could grant them a ghostly chance to see tomorrow's dawn. The young commander stood motionless on the very edge of the dug pit. He was frighteningly calm. He pedantically calculated the width of a ditch capable of reliably breaking the legs of heavy war horses. This was not chaotic digging born of primal fear. This was the precise, strict geometry of intentional mass murder. The jagged line of the deep trench cut across the smooth plain like an ugly scar. The flanks jutted aggressively forward, while the center receded like a coward. Belisarius had intentionally engineered a massive, artificial funnel, a perfect earthen bottleneck designed to suck in the enemy's massed cavalry. Picture yourself at the very bottom of this damp, deep ditch. Your blistered palms have been weeping blood onto the rough wooden shaft of a heavy shovel for hours. Sticky, cold mud is packed tight under your broken fingernails. Your back screams from the hellish, unrelenting strain. You force yourself upright with agonizing effort, spitting out bitter dust that grinds between your teeth. Beside you, an exhausted comrade breathes with a heavy, ragged wheeze. You look at this crooked, endless pit and feel a suffocating, greasy claustrophobia. The damp earth presses in from every side. You're digging a massive grave with your own two hands. You just don't know who it's for yet. You don't feel like a noble warrior of the empire. You feel like a pathetic, powerless ditch digger, doomed and waiting for the inevitable execution. A paralyzing fear crawled through the damp trenches like a thick, tangible fog. But the work didn't stop for a single goddamn second. Belisarius understood the physics of the coming collision far better than any of his gray-haired commanders. 40,000 steel-clad Persian horsemen carry a colossal, lethal momentum. Their primary crushing power is blind building mass. Strip them of that momentum, and that gleaming elite steel instantly turns into heavy, worthless scrap metal. The trench was a clever ploy designed to violently abort that deadly charge. The deep ditch would force the Persian front ranks to slam on the brakes instinctively. The rear ranks, blinded by thick dust and their own bloated pride, would use their momentum to brutally crush their own vanguard into the dirt. Belisarius was cold-bloodedly engineering the perfect enclosed meat grinder. He was methodically constructing a giant mousetrap the size of an entire battlefield. A simple, filthy hole in the ground was meant to compress the invincible elite of Asia into a submissive, paralyzed herd. By the middle of that grueling night, the tension hit its breaking point. The hard, rocky soil refused to give way. Shovels snapped with a dry, sharp crack against hidden boulders. Utterly spent, men collapsed into dead faints right in the muck. There was a very real, terrifying threat that they wouldn't finish before sunrise. An unfinished, shallow trench would have been a perfect pre-dug mass grave for the Romans. The slightest delay meant the total, inevitable annihilation of every last man. Centurions screamed themselves hoarse, ruthlessly driving the exhausted soldiers with heavy whips. The Roman war machine groaned, but it functioned at the absolute limit of human endurance. It was a desperate, frantic race against the clock. The Syrian soil resisted as fiercely and stubbornly as the Persians would tomorrow. But the primal fear of the oncoming Sassanid steamroller proved far stronger than any fatigue. Survival instinct forced bloody, raw hands to frantically tear at the unyielding stone. Dawn finally smeared the horizon with a dirty, dull blood red. The trench was finished. The ugly, zigzagging, deep wound on the plane's body lay in wait for its prey. The Roman infantry collapsed in total exhaustion right at the edge of the dugout ditches. No beautiful, geometrically perfect formation. None of the usual blinding glint of polished armor. Just men caked in gray clay, breathing hard, deathly tired. They blended perfectly into the landscape. They had become one with the sticky mud. Belisarius surveyed his completed work in silence, with icy calm. He didn't give a damn about military aesthetics. He only cared about the dry, brutal, mathematical functionality of the trap. He had built a perfect, foolproof machine for the disposal of another empire's vanity. The earth was hungry. The earth was ready to swallow Persian gold whole. The proud aristocrats of the ancient East, who for centuries had genuinely despised manual labor, were about to pay for that arrogance with their lives. Death often hides ironically in the simplest, most mundane things. This time, it took the most ridiculous form. A crooked hole dug in the mud. This mud had become the Empire's primary, absolute, and only weapon for the day.
Dazzling Persian grandiosity was doomed to shatter against the harsh pragmatism of a dirt ditch. Some fools meticulously polish their parade armor to shine in the sun. Others cold-bloodedly dig into the black earth just to stay alive. In the end, the cold soil takes everyone. The distant horizon suddenly, terrifyingly darkened. The ground beneath their feet gave a faint, treacherous shudder. The dry air quickly filled with a low, steadily building hum. It wasn't an approaching summer storm. It was 40,000 horsemen rolling relentlessly toward their deaths. The dull vibrations of the soil slowly grew into the distinct rhythm of enemy footsteps. Onto the sun-drenched arena stepped a man whose personal pride was as vast as the Persian Empire itself. Perozes looked at the world from beneath heavy, golden eyelids. He was the commander-in-chief of the great Persian army. Behind his straight back, 40,000 elite warriors breathed heavily. They spilled onto the wide plain before Dara like a gleaming river of metal bursting its banks. The sun reflected cruelly off tens of thousands of polished breastplates, mercilessly blinding the Romans who were exhausted from their night's work. This wasn't just a massive army. It was a gargantuan, perfectly tuned machine designed to demonstrate absolute imperial superiority. Perozes didn't doubt his coming victory for a single second. Doubt was for pathetic slaves and cowardly mercenaries. A true aristocrat of ancient blood fed exclusively on total, all-consuming confidence. He hadn't brought this colossal army here to fight. He had brought it to conduct a swift, ceremonial execution. The Romans seemed to him like nothing more than annoying insects, to be crushed ruthlessly under a massive iron-shod boot. Imagine yourself as a simple Syrian recruit at the bottom of a damp, foul-smelling trench. You squint painfully against the unbearably bright, searing light. The steel wave on the horizon slowly, inexorably expands. The shimmering air hums with the low rumble of thousands of hooves. That vibrating sound sinks straight into your knotted stomach. Your mouth goes dry instantly. You grip the wooden shaft of your spear until your knuckles turn white, the wood slick with cold sweat. You stare at this dazzling, rapidly approaching wall of death and feel your absolute pathetic vulnerability. Why did you dig this miserable ditch all night? Can a pile of loose gray dirt really stop inevitable fate? Your comrades in the hole hold their breath. That ominous, heavy silence has fallen, the kind that always precedes a catastrophe. A silence where you can hear the pulse of a doomed man thudding clearly in his temples. Perozes looked down condescendingly at the scarred, dug-up landscape. The ugly, jagged trench only elicited a contemptuous smirk. To the Persian commander-in-chief, this ditch was a clear, undeniable sign of total Roman cowardice. He flatly refused to see a sophisticated engineering trap. He saw only a filthy gutter where cowardly rats hoped in vain to wait out the inevitable storm. Belisarius seemed to him like nothing more than a terrified, incompetent boy who had hysterically ruined a beautiful, level field. Persian tactics hadn't changed in centuries. The heavy cavalry wedge was supposed to simply step over this pathetic obstacle. Arrogance had finally and completely burned away any shred of common sense in the commander's mind. Perozes didn't bother to reform his perfect, calculated lines. He didn't study the narrow throughput of the Roman ditch. He simply, arrogantly, ignored the geometry of the space itself. It was the classic, textbook blindness of the doomed. In the sweltering noon heat, the Persian camp began a leisurely, almost theatrical preparation for their future triumph. Perozes summoned his personal secretary with a careless gesture. He lazily dictated a short, insufferably arrogant message for Belisarius. The text read, "Prepare a bath for me in your city, for this evening I intend to wash the dust of the road from my body in Dara." This message wasn't cheap, soldierly bravado. It was cold, protocol-driven, bureaucratic cynicism. The Persian quartermasters were already busy, pens scratching as they assigned cozy quarters in a Byzantine city they hadn't even captured yet. They were pre-allocating other people's granaries, other people's gold, and other people's lives by the list. They were preparing warm baths with terrifying methodicalness. They simply couldn't imagine that the water would be needed not for living victors, but for cooling corpses. Fate's irony had already raised its invisible butcher's cleaver over their arrogant heads. This haughty, official order to dine in someone else's city became their collective death warrant. All this gleaming pomp was doomed from the start. The excessive grandiosity of a mighty empire was about to shatter with a loud clang against the harsh, ugly mud. The Syrian sun continued to beat down mercilessly, quickly heating the heavy Persian armor into glowing copper ovens. The Sassanid army obediently formed into two perfectly straight, endless ranks. It was a stunning, hypnotic sight. Gleaming red gold, expensive colored silk banners, the motionless faces of commanders. They stood silently before the dugout scaffold, impatiently waiting for the short order to advance. Belisarius, meanwhile, remained absolutely cool, almost bored in his silence. He sat motionless at his elevated command post, dryly assessing the rapidly closing distance. He didn't look at this magnificent enemy as living human beings. He looked at them as surplus biomass to be quickly and surgically disposed of. Dazzling pride always works like a potent, reliable drug. It completely numbs the natural instinct for self-preservation. It makes a man fervently believe in his own exceptionalism, even while standing on the very edge of a deep abyss.
Perozes snapped his right hand up, encased in expensive, patterned metal. Massive war drums began to beat with a dull, rhythmic thud.
A brass trumpet shrieked a signal that instantly curdled the blood. The giant steel mechanism of the ancient East lurched into irreversible motion. 40,000 iron-clad horsemen spurred their thoroughbreds forward in unison. The massive, sun-drenched, gleaming bulk slowly began to pick up its fatal speed with a terrifying roar. They truly believed they were flying on the wings of the wind toward an easy victory ordained by fate itself. But in harsh reality, they were flying blindly and obediently straight into a damp, ugly trench. The trap, which had looked like a mere scratch from above, was preparing to swing its jagged maw wide open. The Persian front ranks were closing in on the invisible line. The perfect formation was about to shatter against the geometry of chaos. While the dazzling steel avalanche rolled across the smooth plain with a deafening roar, an absolute, paralyzing silence hung at the bottom of the ugly trench. Roman legionnaires pressed themselves into the sticky mud. They only tightened their grip on the rough shafts of their spears. The ground wasn't just shaking anymore. It was thrashing in a violent fever under the heavy hooves of tens of thousands of war horses. The Persian vanguard flew forward in the sweet anticipation of a swift, elegant slaughter. The riders looked straight ahead through the narrow slits of their closed helms. They saw only a pathetic, uneven scratch on the ground. The illusion of absolute control stayed with them until the very last fatal second. The first Sassanid ranks only realized the true horror of the situation at the very edge of the drop. This wasn't just a shallow ditch. It was a deep, wide maw, a maw capable of swallowing a horseman whole. Survival instinct kicked in faster than any vaunted warrior pride. The front ranks yanked desperately on their stiff leather reins.
Elite steeds screamed. They reared back on their haunches. They kicked up thick clouds of suffocating gray dust. The offensive choked instantly. The gleaming charge ground to a halt. But only the first rank stopped. The rest of the 40,000-strong mass couldn't see a thing. The rear echelons were stone-blind in the dense dust cloud. They kept driving their horses forward frantically, driven by the thunder of their own drums and their own murderous momentum. Crowd physics ruthlessly took over. The rear ranks slammed into the halted vanguard with monstrous force. Imagine yourself as that noble Persian youth in the very center of the formation. You were just savoring the thought of a glorious, quick victory. Suddenly, the steel-clad back of the comrade in front of you smashes into your horse's face with a sickening crunch. From behind, another ton of living, iron-clad meat immediately piles onto you. You can't lift your arm to draw your heavy sword. You can't turn your head. You are simply crushed in a giant, ruthless steel vise. Your expensive breastplate treacherously digs into your own ribs. You hear the dull screech of buckling armor and the snap of breaking bones. You try to suck in the scorching air, but your lungs are mercilessly compressed. You slowly suffocate inside your own expensive armor. You are pinned from all sides by the same doomed, blinded narcissists. No beautiful, noble duels. No honor sung of in legends. Only suffocation, primal panic, and the foul grinding of metal on metal. In a matter of minutes, the perfect, invincible cavalry of ancient Asia turned into a massive, helpless heap. The geometry of Belisarius's trench worked flawlessly. The jagged line of the ditch compressed the attackers into a dense, paralyzed target. Horses tumbled into the deep pit. Men crushed each other to death with their own weight. And at that exact moment, the Romans rose silently from the mud.
The young general didn't order a foolish frontal counterattack. The Roman infantry struck the enemy's completely immobilized flanks with cold-blooded method. The legionnaires weren't fighting anymore. They were doing a job. They were cold-bloodedly butchering a paralyzed foe. Soldiers simply walked to the edge of their safe ditch and delivered fatal blows from above. They drove long spears into exposed necks. They stabbed at vulnerable joints. They thrust into the narrow gaps of luxurious Persian armor. The price the Eastern Empire was paying for its ambitions was truly monstrous. Blood flowed in thick streams over the dry earth, quickly turning the dust into a slick, sticky mess. It was a routine, filthy slaughterhouse. Every swing of a Roman infantryman's arm meant another imperial asset permanently liquidated. Gold sank into the mud. The very concept of chivalrous warfare sank into the mud. Perozes, watching the catastrophe from a safe hill, was literally choking on his own impotent rage. His brilliant, guaranteed-to-win plan was turning into a humiliating crush before his eyes. Proud aristocrats were dying submissively in the muck, like nameless cattle driven to the slaughter. The commander screamed new orders in a frenzy, but his words were lost without a trace in the deafening roar of the dying crowd. The great Sassanid army was completely paralyzed by its own excessive weight. The first day of the grand slaughter slowly drew to a close. It left behind only mountains of twisted metal and the low moans of the fallen on the plain. The dazzling pride of the East had been ruthlessly trampled into the Syrian mud. Some built plans for great conquests, others just dug a hole, and all hopes shattered against the cold earth. But Perozes physically could not retreat. To admit final defeat to a miserable ditch meant certain execution upon returning to the palace of the King of Kings. That night, as the dust settled slightly, a new plan was already brewing in the Persian commander's luxurious tent. A plan that flatly rejected honor. A plan that relied on greed. While the surviving legionnaires silently washed sticky blood from their dulled weapons, figures were already slipping through the darkness between the camps. Men who knew the exact market value of any betrayal. The market value of betrayal that deep night was measured solely in heavy, clinking coin. War had finally dropped the fake mask of a noble imperial duel. It exposed its true, ulcerated, hideous face, the face of a filthy, cynical night market. Under the thick cover of the Syrian night, cautious footsteps rustled silently between the two exhausted camps. These were experienced traders in other men's lives. They knew the exact price of every drop of blood spilled. Inside the massive, luxurious tent of the Persian commander-in-chief, the air was thick and stale with the smell of cold sweat, the smell of naked, animal fear. Perozes hurled curses at his trembling servants in a rage. He paced nervously across priceless silk carpets, like a leopard trapped in a cramped cage. The first day of battle had turned into an unprecedented public disgrace for him. His wounded pride imperiously demanded immediate compensation. Compensation in the form of someone else's torn flesh. He hurriedly sketched new, detailed attack plans with a shaky hand. He planned a crushing cavalry strike against the Roman left flank. He wanted to elegantly bypass that damned, ugly trench. He hungered to trample the Byzantine infantry. But generals in expensive silks always share one fatal weakness. They are far too overconfident in their reliance on mercenaries. The Arab allies of the Persian crown had entirely different, purely pragmatic plans for this someone else's war. Ideological loyalty lives only as long as it's generously paid for in solid silver. The Persians arrogantly paid only with empty, worthless promises of a great future triumph. Belisarius paid in real gold, gold that felt good weighing down a belt. Imagine yourself in the skin of such a night defector. You creep silently through the freezing mist. A small piece of crumpled parchment is clenched tight in your sweaty, filthy palm. These are Perozes' secret drafts. This is the exact step-by-step plan for tomorrow's slaughter. Your racing heart thuds painfully in your temples. You cold-bloodedly sell the ambitions of a vast empire for a bag of clinking metal. You feel absolutely no remorse. You feel only the devilish thrill of an incredibly lucrative deal. Almost no one was sleeping in the Roman fortified camp. The young general sat motionless by a dim, smoking campfire. Belisarius listened to the garbled whispers of the Arab scouts with a terrifying, icy calm. Disgustedly, without looking into their shifty eyes, he tossed them the promised heavy purse. Not a single muscle in his face twitched as he received the keys to tomorrow's unconditional victory. To him, it was just a successful business deal closed on time. He had just bought the lives of thousands of his legionnaires at a very favorable exchange rate. The enraged Perozes' plan lay right in front of him, completely predictable, clumsily straightforward, intellectually pathetic. Belisarius mentally picked up his invisible surgical scalpel once again. He urgently needed the perfect, juicy bait for a Persian aristocrat blinded by rage. This bait had to know how to die as convincingly as possible. Belisarius immediately summoned the commanders of the Hunnic mercenaries. The grim, wild steppe-dwellers stood darkly before the refined, clean-shaven general from the capital. They reeked of acrid horse sweat, sour milk, and raw leather. They sullenly expected harsh orders for a heroic, last-stand defense of the weak flank. They expected the usual grand speeches about the glory of Rome. But Belisarius spoke to them in a completely different language, the only one they understood. The language of absolute, naked, primal greed. The Roman commander-in-chief didn't ask them to die for someone else's homeland. He, dryly, without emotion, ordered them to play the part of shameful cowards. The Huns were to take the brunt of the Persian flank attack first, and then they were to flee backward in a natural, panicked rout, to feign a total, unconditional collapse of the defense. The steppe warriors frowned in disapproval. A sharp tension hung in the air. For a proud, nomadic warrior, fleeing the battlefield without looking back is an indelible stain of shame. Belisarius countered this unspoken argument with lethal simplicity and genius. He didn't offer them ephemeral martial glory. He guaranteed them the exclusive, indisputable right to total plunder. "Look closely at their horses," the general said softly, insinuatingly, pointing a slender finger toward the enemy fires. "That is the finest elite in all of Asia. They are clad from head to toe in pure silver. Their parade harness is worth far more than your entire miserable life. Play the part of wild fear. Lure them into my steel trap, and every Persian steed killed will become your personal, legal property. I officially grant you their wealth." The coarse faces of the mercenaries changed instantly, beyond recognition. Honor predictably became a hollow sound when entire herds of priceless war horses were suddenly on the line. War had finally and unconditionally become a cold business. Gold and greed worked 1,000 times more effectively than any valor sung by poets. The sordid pact was sealed instantly with a sharp, predatory nod. The Hunnic commanders dissolved into the night like silent shadows, their anticipation of a colossal haul almost palpable. Meanwhile, the Roman war machine busied itself preparing for a grand theatrical performance, a show where the only price of admission was a human life. Belisarius wove his viscous web with cold-blooded precision. He bought the enemy's secrets for a pittance. He purchased the cowardice of unreliable allies at a bargain.
He transformed the ancient battlefield into a vast auction house. Some sold their honor for the ring of coin. Others bought victory with the blood of their fellows. But death always held the highest stakes in this game. The short summer night was fading fast. On the eastern horizon, the dim dawn of the second day slowly broke. A dawn destined to be the absolute last for those who believed too fervently in their own invincibility. Morning shattered the silence with the low bray of bronze horns. As the night shadows retreated into deep ravines, blind death crept back onto the blood-soaked plain. The second day of the battle commenced strictly according to the schematic purchased during the night. Perozes had learned nothing. He had failed to absorb a single word of yesterday's sordid lesson. He hungered only for swift, exemplary revenge. He massed his surviving elite cavalry on the right wing, personally leveling his heavy spear at the vulnerable left flank of the Roman positions. There, the wild Huns stood with studied negligence. The Persian commander-in-chief curled his thin lips in contempt. A dull thud of a war drum followed. The crushing cavalry ram lurched forward. The earth groaned once more under thousands of heavy hooves as the gleaming steamroller picked up its murderous momentum. The riders flew forward, desperate to wash away yesterday's unbearable shame with fresh enemy blood. The collision was deafening. The dry snap of splintering wood drowned out the hoarse screams of men. The Hunnic mercenaries took the initial blow upon their light shields and immediately began their well-rehearsed performance. The nomads acted out a state of abject panic with startling realism. They intentionally broke their own formation, shrieking in feigned, primitive terror as they jerked their short steppe horses around. Then they ran. They fled in absolute chaos, never looking back. The Roman flank appeared to be disintegrating. The Persian commanders roared in triumph, the sweet taste of long-awaited victory instantly poisoning their reason. They believed wholeheartedly in this cheap street theater. They believed in their own unquestionable exceptionalism. As a wise contemporary of those terrible hours wrote, "The enemy mistook another's cunning for their own valor, and their own blindness for divine providence." The illusion of imminent victory became their most ruthless executioner. Imagine yourself in the rigid saddle of a Persian charger. The wind whistles fiercely through the narrow slits of your heavy helm. Your lungs greedily gulp down hot dust mixed with the scent of another man's fear. You see only the ragged backs of fleeing barbarians ahead. You raise your heavy sword high for the killing blow, your blood boiling with the thrill of the hunt. You pursue the quarry with feverish excitement, considering yourself the apex of creation, the untouchable elite of a great empire. There are no doubts, no thoughts of stopping, only the intoxicating, insane speed. You are physically incapable of noticing your fatal mistake. You do not see how fast you are outpacing your slow infantry, nor do you notice how your own flanks have become lethally exposed. You fly proudly on the wings of imperial pride, but in reality, you are plunging blindly into a bottomless abyss. Intoxicated by easy success, the Sassanid cavalry pushed deeper into the Roman lines, swallowing meters of enemy territory with frightening, insatiable greed. They completely forgot the vital necessity of rear support. This was no longer a disciplined military maneuver. It was a wild, uncontrolled mounted hunt. The tripwire of Belisarius's ingenious trap was stretching to its breaking point. The young general stood atop a high hill, perfectly still, resembling a cold marble statue. He did not bark out frantic orders. He merely counted the passing seconds with the precision of a chronometer. He watched the surreal scene in silence as the finest cavalry in Asia, voluntarily and with joyful shouts, rode into the prepared earthen abattoir. The Persians had wedged themselves too deep into the Roman formation, breaking the cardinal rule of war. They had irrevocably severed contact with their base,
exposing their own vulnerable flanks to those waiting patiently in ambush. The dust hung like a thick, impenetrable gray wall, concealing the true scale of the looming catastrophe. The Persian vanguard was ecstatically hacking down the slowest, lagging Huns, the aristocrats laughing in the face of approaching death. What would you do, standing just one step from absolute triumph? Would you be able to stop and look around? They certainly could not. The momentum of their colossal hubris proved far stronger than the instinct for self-preservation. They continued to furiously lash their exhausted horses. Suddenly, the steppe wind shifted. The thick gray shroud thinned, and in that moment, an old Persian centurion saw something terrifying. The Huns, fleeing ahead, suddenly ceased their frantic screaming. They no longer looked like a frightened mob. Synchronously, like a single well-oiled machine, they hauled on their reins. The wild horde stopped dead in its tracks and silently turned to face its pursuers. In that brief, terrifying second, time froze. The deafening thunder of thousands of hooves seemed to fade into a distant whisper. The tension of the trap finally snapped with a quiet, ominous pop. The Huns efficiently drew their short, incredibly powerful bows. They were no longer running. They smiled with predatory hunger. They did not see an invincible army before them. They saw a massive herd of thoroughbred horses glistening in the sun. Horses that, under the terms of the knight's deal, already belonged to them. The Persian riders tried to break, but the heavy, monolithic mass of the rear ranks pushed them forward relentlessly. The cold laws of physics played the same cruel joke on them for the second day in a row. They were tightly squeezed into a narrow corridor between their own distant infantry and the mercenaries who had turned to face them. The calculated snare was snapping shut. Belisarius slowly, almost lazily, raised his right hand. This simple, economical gesture cost the lives of thousands. It was the long-awaited signal for the hidden Roman cohorts. All this time, they had sat in absolute silence within the deep ravines on the flanks, waiting for the perfect moment of enemy vulnerability. That moment had arrived. Belisarius had sold the Persians a beautiful illusion of victory at a great profit, and the Persians paid for the forgery with their lives. Greed always kills more effectively than the sharpest iron. They chased cheap glory and, at full gallop, rode into their own mass execution. When pride blinds the mind, any victorious charge becomes merely a picturesque road to damnation. The steel gates of that hell had already begun to clang shut. While the Persian vanguard, blinded by pride, reined in with terror before the Huns, the ground on the flanks literally exploded. Belisarius's hand dropped sharply. This short gesture, devoid of theatricality, became the catalyst for the greatest slaughter of the 6th century. The Roman ambush regiments lunged forward. They did not let out victorious cries. They maintained the chilling silence of professional executioners. Rome's heavy cavalry slammed at high speed into the defenseless flanks of the Persian wedge. The trap snapped shut with a sickening metallic clang. The perfect geometric figure of the snare finally took its final shape. The Sassanid cavalry was pinned from 3 sides. Ahead stood a wall of nomads hungry for loot. From the flanks, fresh imperial riders pressed in relentlessly, and from behind, their own bewildered infantry blindly pushed forward. Imagine yourself inside this rapidly shrinking iron box. You are a noble warrior, accustomed to open space and elegant maneuvers, sitting upon a magnificent warhorse. But now, you cannot move a single finger. From the left, the bloated carcass of your own killed horse presses against you. From the right, someone else's blunt spear methodically stabs into your ribs.
You gasp for air in a cloud of thick, acrid dust. The scorching air is saturated with sticky fear and the heavy scent of doom. You cannot see your enemy to return a blow. You only feel in horror as your priceless armor creaks and buckles under the colossal pressure. Your elite, gleaming panoply has turned into a personal, suffocating sarcophagus. There is no fair fight, no warrior's honor. You are simply being methodically slaughtered like cattle in a pen that is too small. Every breath brings only sharp pain. Every passing second brings your ignominious end closer. This was not a battle in the classical sense celebrated by poets. It was a cold-blooded, surgical operation in mass liquidation. Belisarius watched the proceedings from a high point with absolute detachment, like a dispassionate industrialist monitoring the smooth operation of his machines. He had turned the wide plain into great industrial millstones, and those ruthless stones were now grinding the finest cavalry in Asia into useless chaff. The Romans worked with extreme method, without unnecessary malice, without the slightest show of heroism. They simply delivered fatal thrusts into the vulnerable points of the squeezed crowd. The Huns cold-bloodedly sniped paralyzed targets with their horn bows, taking care not to damage the expensive Persian helmets and horse tack. The greed of the mercenaries made their shots startlingly accurate. Death here had been assigned a clear market value, devoid of grandeur, frighteningly mundane, and infinitely filthy. The annihilation was absolute, lasting a mere 20 minutes. 20 insane minutes to grind the century-old pride of a powerful empire into bloody powder. The 40,000-man army that had arrogantly threatened to wash the road dust off in Roman baths had itself turned into dust under the heavy hooves of Byzantine horses. The invincible Sassanid elite ceased to exist. Those unfortunates who were not pierced by steel suffocated agonizingly under the weight of their fallen comrades. The few who tried to surrender were ruthlessly trampled by animals driven mad by terror. The claustrophobic press of chaos reached its critical peak. The thick air vibrated with the death rattles of hundreds and the ring of metal shattering. The Roman war machine was merely performing an administrative task. No one asked for leniency. No one gave quarter. The pathos of the ancient East choked on its own blood in a grotesque geometric snare. The speed of this mechanical slaughter shocked even the battle-hardened legionaries. When the last convulsions of the defeated finally went silent, a frightening, unnatural stillness settled over the mired plain. The Syrian soil was thickly carpeted in mangled silver and dull gold. The hot wind slowly dispersed the dust clouds, ruthlessly exposing the scale of the bloody work. This was the market price of hubris, a monstrous bill for pride presented by a cold intellect. The steel trap had closed perfectly. The young general Belisarius had proven a humiliating truth. Any army, no matter how powerful, loses to soulless mathematics. Some commanders came to this war in ceremonial armor to pose for future legends. Others came in filthy tunics just to do their jobs and survive. The outcome was predictable. Gold glitters in the sun, but iron logic rules the earth. The Persian aristocrats rode into this day as masters of the world, but they remained in it as ordinary fertilizer. The dust finally settled on the exhausted Syrian earth. Instead of the deafening roar of tens of thousands, a thick, ringing silence hung over the plain. This silence was more terrifying than any battle cry. It smelled of cooling blood, ruptured horse bellies, and rusted iron. The great battle was over. It was time for the most clinical, most sordid part of any war: cold imperial bookkeeping. While the surviving legionaries collapsed in exhaustion into the mud next to the mutilated bodies of their enemies, the real victors took to the field, men with impeccably clean hands. Imperial bureaucrats, quartermasters, and gaunt treasurers scurried between the mounds of dead,
fastidiously tucking up the hems of their tunics so as not to stain them in clotted blood. The war of romantics had ended. The routine work of the logisticians had begun. Imagine yourself in the place of one of these nameless Byzantine clerks. You walk slowly through the slippery mess. Beneath your thin leather sandal, trampled pride yields treacherously. But you are not concerned with an extinguished life. Your eyes are fixed on the silver harness of a killed Persian stallion. You pull a smooth wax tablet and a sharp copper stylus from your robe. You busily pry off a piece of precious metal to check its purity. You dryly multiply the weight of the trophies by the current market rate of silver in distant Constantinople. You do not see the tragedy of a collapsed elite. You see only the yield of today's slaughter. The thin stylus rhythmically scrapes against the wax. Scrape. A heartbeat. Scrape again. This quiet, bureaucratic sound drowns out the last groans of the dying. The dead are merely spent materiel, but their golden breastplates are an excellent addition to the state budget. Life is worth nothing, but death brings excellent dividends. While the treasurers converted mangled Persian glory into hard currency, a new geopolitical reality was being born, hundreds of miles away. News of the annihilation reached the heir, Khosrow. He did not tear his silk robes in despair. He was too intelligent for such cheap theatrical effects. He analyzed the dry facts with absolute detachment. The elite cavalry his ancestors had prayed to had proven to be a useless, lumbering piece of iron. Monolithic hierarchy and the primal fear of dishonor had killed 40,000 warriors more effectively than any Roman spear. Khosrow drew painful but vital conclusions. He realized their old system was irrevocably dead. This catastrophe was not a reason for tears, but a brutal textbook on the anatomy of systemic failure. The trauma of humiliation now shifted as a heavy burden onto the shoulders of the Persian crown. Power always demands a regular mass sacrifice of fools on the altar of progress. And what of the architect of this charnel house? Belisarius had no intention of holding pompous celebrations. The victor did not bask in glory or deliver grand speeches. His tent stood alone on a small rise, lashed by the evening wind. Inside, a dim oil lamp burned steadily. The commander-in-chief sat motionless at a field desk, tiredly rubbing his eyes. The ingenious trench that had saved the empire no longer held the slightest interest for him. With a dismissive gesture, he wiped the drawing of the ditch from the sand in the corner of the tent. Spent materiel. A one-time engineering action, written off forever. Tomorrow, the trench would be filled by the wind, and in a few years, thorny grass would grow there again. The general pulled fresh maps of the eastern provinces toward him. They brought him a modest dinner, stale bread and bland cheese. Belisarius chewed slowly, his cold gaze never leaving the new logistical tasks. The butcher had merely finished his shift, removed his apron, and sat down to plan the next slaughter. In historical hell, there is always work for tomorrow. This is the unvarnished face of great achievements. This battle was not an epic clash between light and darkness. It was the culmination of soulless calculation. It was the triumph of a sordid trench over glittering gold. Millions of descendants will read about this day in dry academic texts and admire the genius of the commander, but they will never smell the fear or hear the cynical scratch of the accountant's pen. Empires are not born to noble hymns. They are ground into dust because someone more calculating understood the calculus of another's hubris. Heroes merely perish in the mud, while cynics take their weapons and write a new history. And here arises the most uncomfortable question. Answer yourself with total honesty. If the greatest victories of civilization are invariably built on purchased cowardice, deception, and the ruthless calculation of human meat, Is there any point in taking pride in a past where the highest virtue was the efficiency with which one turned men into carrion?